The stars had always belonged to humanity's imagination long before they belonged to its machines. For thousands of years they had watched them from the surface of a small blue planet, tiny sparks scattered across an endless black ocean. Children pointed at them. Scientists built telescopes to study them. Dreamers wrote poems about them. Entire generations grew up believing that someday, somehow, humanity would reach them. The stars were not just distant lights. They were a promise. A promise that the universe was larger than the world humanity had been born into. A promise that somewhere beyond the sky waited discoveries, dangers, civilizations, and wonders that no human had yet imagined. For most of human history, that promise felt impossibly far away. Then, slowly, technology began to close the distance. Satellites came first. Then space stations. Then the first permanent colonies on the Moon and Mars. Each step forward felt like another rung on a ladder stretching toward the stars. And eventually, humanity did what it had always believed it would do. They built their first faster-than-light drive. It was not elegant. It was not efficient. It was barely stable enough to test safely outside the orbit of the Moon. But it worked. For 6 seconds. 6 seconds of impossible velocity that proved the laws of the universe had just opened a door. Humanity celebrated for exactly 9 hours. Then the Concord arrived. No one saw their ships enter the solar system. One moment the space around Earth was empty. The next moment 12 enormous vessels hung silently in orbit above the planet. They were older than any technology humanity had ever built. Their hulls were smooth and dark, shaped like long curved blades drifting through space. Blue lights moved slowly along their surfaces, and their engines burned with a quiet glow that made human reactors look primitive by comparison. They did not fire weapons. They did something worse. They sent a message. Within minutes, every satellite, every station, every communication network on Earth received the same transmission translated into every human language. Humanity had violated 17 interstellar protocols. Those protocols existed to regulate the development of pre-contact civilizations and to prevent unstable species from destabilizing the wider galactic community. Therefore, for the safety of all involved, humanity's access to interstellar technology would be managed. That was the word the Concord used. Managed. Humanity was informed that faster-than-light drives were restricted technology. The prototype vessel was confiscated. All research programs related to FTL travel were suspended under Concord oversight. Earth would remain inside its solar system until the Concord determined humanity had reached what they called developmental maturity. No one on Earth had ever heard of the Concord before that day. But suddenly they were everywhere. Their ships formed a quiet ring around the outer edge of the solar system. Sensor arrays appeared in deep space. Patrol vessels began drifting through the dark between planets like silent guardians. They called it a protective quarantine. Humanity called it something else. A cage. 62 years passed. 2 full human generations grew up beneath the Concord's watch. Commander Yara Oei had been born during the blockade's 20th year. She had never known a time when the stars were something humanity could reach. She stood now at the observation window of the orbital platform Meridian, looking out into the quiet darkness beyond Earth. The platform was technically a research station. In practice, it was a watchtower. From Meridian's wide forward viewport, the blockade could be seen clearly on a good day. Concord patrol cruisers drifted in careful patterns far beyond the Moon's orbit. Their blue running lights traced slow arcs through space as they followed flight paths that never changed. The ships were beautiful in the way weapons often were. Long, perfectly engineered. Built with the quiet confidence of civilizations that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. Yara had spent 5 years on Meridian watching those ships. She knew every patrol route. Every shift change, every sensor sweep, every tiny movement of the fleet that surrounded humanity's world. She knew the blockade the way a prisoner knows the walls of their cell. Behind her, the station hummed with the steady sound of machinery and life support systems. The Meridian had been approved by the Concord itself, an observation platform they allowed Earth to maintain because its engines were slow and its weapons outdated. It posed no threat. That had been the Concord's official assessment. Yara rested her hands behind her back and watched one of the patrol cruisers glide across the darkness. Its engines flared gently as it turned along the edge of the quarantine line. The maneuver was precise, elegant, completely routine. The Concorde had been performing this same patrol pattern for 62 years. They expected to keep performing it for 62 more. Yara felt the familiar quiet anger settle into her chest. Not hot anger. Not reckless anger. Something colder. Something sharper. Her grandmother had once stood outside the United Nations building with a cardboard sign that read simply, "Let US leave." The protests had lasted for years. Millions of people had marched. Governments had argued. Diplomats had negotiated endlessly with Concord representatives who spoke calmly and politely about patience, stability, and the responsibilities of advanced civilizations. The blockade had never changed. Eventually humanity stopped protesting. Instead, they adapted. They built stations like Meridian. They expanded mining operations on the moon. They turned Mars into a growing colony. Life inside the cage continued. But the dream of the stars never disappeared. It simply waited. Yara was still staring at the patrol cruiser when the door behind her slid open. Footsteps crossed the floor quickly. "Commander," a voice said. Yara turned. Dr. Ilya Saw stood in the doorway holding a data tablet, his hair disheveled and his eyes sharp with the kind of excitement that usually meant he had discovered something unusual. Saw was one of Meridian's senior scientists. He had a habit of forgetting to sleep when his research became interesting. Judging by the dark circles under his eyes, it had been interesting for a while. "You need to see this," he said. Yara accepted the tablet and looked down at the display. Sensor readings filled the screen. Data from Meridian's long-range monitoring systems aimed toward the outer edge of the Concord blockade. At first glance it looked like ordinary noise. But then she noticed the pattern. Regular. Repeating. Precise. Something beyond the blockade line was transmitting signals. Small pulses at irregular intervals. Not random. Testing. Probing. Yara looked up slowly. "How long?" she asked. Saw rubbed his eyes. 6 weeks. Yara felt the quiet anger inside her sharpen into something else. Something colder. Something that felt very much like the beginning of a storm. She turned back toward the observation window. Far out in the darkness, the Concord patrol ships continued their endless orbit around Earth. Watching. Guarding. Controlling. But somewhere beyond them, something was watching back. Dr. Ilya Saw did not speak again while Yara studied the data. The observation deck was quiet except for the low hum of Meridian systems and the distant murmur of crew voices somewhere deeper inside the station. Outside the viewport, Earth turned slowly beneath them, its oceans reflecting sunlight like liquid glass. But Yara's attention was not on the planet. It was on the numbers. The sensor logs showed a repeating pattern of energy pulses coming from far beyond the Concorde's outer patrol line. At first glance, they could have been dismissed as cosmic interference or natural radiation fluctuations. Except they weren't random. Every pulse was slightly different from the one before it. Small changes in frequency. Small changes in angle. Small changes in duration. Each signal tested the boundary in a different way. Like fingers pressing against a wall, searching for a weak place in the stone. Yara looked up. "You reported this already?" Saw nodded. 4 weeks ago. I sent everything to Earth Council Intelligence and copied the Concord Patrol Network, just in case. And? They said it was probably sensor drift. Yara glanced back at the data. "Do you believe that?" Saw shook his head immediately. "No." He pointed at the tablet. "Look here." He zoomed the display outward. The signal locations appeared as tiny dots scattered along the outer edge of the blockade perimeter. At first they looked random. Then Saw activated a time overlay. The dots connected. A pattern emerged. Over 6 weeks, the signals had gradually moved closer together, slowly narrowing toward one section of the Concord perimeter. Yara recognized the region instantly. Every Meridian officer knew it. It was the weakest stretch of the patrol line. Fewer ships. Longer response times. a gap in sensor overlap created by the gravitational distortion of a nearby asteroid belt. The Concord had never bothered to fix it. They didn't believe anything dangerous existed close enough to threaten the blockade. Yara looked back at Sa. It's mapping the perimeter. Yes. Learning the patrol routes. Yes. And testing response times. Sa nodded again. Exactly. Yara's eyes moved slowly across the screen. Something out there had spent 6 weeks studying the Concord's defenses. That meant one of two things. Either it was extremely cautious, or extremely patient. Neither option was comforting. Outside the window, a Concord patrol cruiser drifted past the far edge of the solar system. Its blue running lights traced a perfect arc as it completed its scheduled maneuver. Beautiful. Precise. Predictable. The Concord had performed the same patrol pattern for decades. If something had been studying them long enough, the pattern would be easy to understand. Easy to anticipate. Yara handed the tablet back to Sa. Continue monitoring. You think it's intelligent? Yara did not answer immediately. She turned toward the viewport again. Beyond the patrol ships was nothing but darkness. Empty space. Cold vacuum stretching for trillions of kilometers. But now she knew that darkness wasn't empty anymore. Something was moving through it. Finally she spoke. Yes. Sa looked uneasy. What do we do? Yara crossed the room toward the communications console. We report it again. He hesitated. And if the Concord ignores it? Yara paused. For 62 years humanity had obeyed the Concord's restrictions. They had followed every protocol, every inspection, every request for compliance. And still they had been treated like children. Still they had been locked inside their own solar system. Still their dreams of the stars had been dismissed as premature. Yara opened the communication channel. This is Commander Yara Oae of In Meridian, she said calmly. Her voice carried across the station and out into deep space through Concord monitoring frequencies. I am submitting a priority sensor report regarding anomalous signal activity beyond the outer blockade perimeter. Pattern indicates intelligent probing of Concord defensive positions. She attached the full data file and transmitted it. A moment later, the confirmation light blinked. Message received. Forwarded to Concord Patrol Command. Now they would wait. The response arrived 57 minutes later. Yara was still on the observation deck when the alert chimed. Sa looked up from his workstation immediately. That was fast. Yara opened the message. The text filled the screen. Acknowledged. Situation under review. That was all. No follow-up. No questions. No request for additional data. Just 2 sentences. Sa frowned. That's it. Yara stared at the message a moment longer. Then she closed the file. They received the report. That's not the same as taking it seriously. No, Yara said quietly. It isn't. Over the next 72 hours, the signals changed. The pulses stopped spreading along the blockade perimeter. They began focusing. Every transmission now originated from nearly the same location in deep space, directly aligned with the weakest section of the Concord patrol grid. Whatever was out there had finished studying. Now it was approaching. Sa noticed the shift first. He rushed into the observation deck with another tablet full of sensor updates. It's moving, he said. Yara examined the readings. Distance markers confirmed it. The source of the signals had begun advancing slowly toward the blockade line. Still outside Concord territory. Still too far away for visual confirmation. But closing the distance. How fast? Yara asked. Hard to tell exactly. The signals are indirect, but based on drift calculations. He hesitated. About 300 kilometers per hour. Yara raised an eyebrow. That's slow. Extremely. Almost deliberate. Sa nodded. Like it's not in a hurry. Yara turned back to the viewport. The Concord ships were still performing their usual patrol rotations. But something about them felt different. At first she couldn't place it. Then she realized what it was. The patrol cruisers had started repositioning. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would draw attention to a casual observer. Just small changes. Subtle shifts in flight paths. Ships that normally held the outer perimeter were drifting slightly farther away, opening space, creating distance, slowly creating a gap. Saw followed her gaze. You see it too? Yes. He swallowed. They're not moving to intercept. No. Yara's voice was calm, but inside her chest the cold anger had returned. Sharper than before. They're moving out of the way. Sa looked back at the sensor data. Why would they do that? Yara didn't answer. Because she already knew. Or at least she feared she did. Something powerful enough to make the Concord step aside was approaching the solar system. And the corridor they were opening pointed in only one direction. Straight toward Earth. Late that night the outer perimeter alarm sounded. The sound echoed through Meridian's corridors like a warning bell. Every display across the station lit up simultaneously. Sa's voice came through the intercom. Commander, you need to see this. Yara ran back to the sensor station. The new readings filled the screen. The signal source had reached the blockade line. And something massive had crossed it. The sensor return was unlike anything in Meridian's database. Size estimates fluctuated wildly as the system tried to interpret the readings. At first it reported 10 kilometers. Then 50. Then 200. Finally it stabilized. Estimated structure diameter, 298 kilometers. Sa stared at the numbers. That can't be right. Yara looked at the external sensors. Far beyond the Concord patrol ships, a dark shape had appeared against the stars. It did not reflect light. It swallowed it. The Concord fleet did not engage. They did not intercept. They simply held position. Watching. Yara felt something settle inside her chest. Not fear. Something colder. A realization. The Concord hadn't failed to stop the thing approaching the solar system. They had chosen not to. Because the corridor they opened led directly to Earth. For the first few minutes after the object crossed the blockade line, no one on Meridian spoke. The sensor room was filled with quiet breathing, the faint tapping of keyboards, and the constant stream of data pouring across the displays. The numbers kept updating. Size estimates. Mass approximations. Radiation readings. None of them made sense. The object was too large to be a ship. Too structured to be a natural asteroid. Too slow to be a weapon. And far too controlled to be drifting randomly through space. Sa leaned closer to the display. It's not accelerating. Yara looked at the velocity data. He was right. The object was moving with steady, controlled motion. No visible propulsion, no visible engine flare. Just silent movement. 300 kilometers per hour. A deliberate pace. Almost curious. What about the Concord fleet? Yara asked. A navigation officer pulled up the tactical map. 23 Concord patrol ships surrounded the outer perimeter of the solar system. But instead of moving to intercept the object, they were doing something else. They were shifting position. Not aggressively. Not defensively. Just adjusting. The cruisers that normally held the perimeter closest to the anomaly had slowly pulled back over the past few hours. Opening space. Widening the gap. The corridor through the blockade had grown wider. Much wider. Sa stared at the map. They're not defending the line. No, Yara said quietly. They're clearing it. 3 hours later the first images arrived. Not from Meridian. From the Concord. One of their deep-range sensor arrays transmitted a long-range visual scan across the monitoring channels. The image resolution was poor. But it was enough. The room went completely silent. The object was not a ship. It was something else entirely. A structure. A vast, irregular mass that looked partly mechanical and partly alive. Its surface was uneven and shifting. Some sections appeared metallic, others organic, like coral or bone. Long filament-like tendrils drifted behind it in space, stretching for kilometers before curling slowly back toward the main body. Sections of the structure rotated slowly. Others pulsed with faint internal light. There was no obvious front. No obvious engines. No weapons. Just a massive presence drifting through the darkness like a floating continent. One of the junior technicians whispered something under his breath. Yara didn't hear the words. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room was thinking the same thing. The object was enormous. Nearly 300 kilometers across. Large enough to swallow entire cities. Large enough to dwarf any ship humanity had ever built. Sa zoomed the image. Look here. A section of the object opened slowly. Not like a door. More like a biological membrane peeling back. Inside, something moved. Not machinery. Something else. Something too large to be identified clearly by the distant sensors. Sa stepped back from the console. That thing isn't just mechanical. No, Yara said. It isn't. The object did not move toward Earth immediately. Instead, it changed course slightly. Its path shifted toward one of the Concord patrol cruisers stationed near the outer boundary. The ship was called Reth Vadel, according to the Concord Identification Registry. 2 kilometers long. One of the larger vessels in the patrol fleet. More powerful than every warship humanity had ever built combined. Sa looked at the tactical screen. The Concord will intercept it. Yara didn't answer. They both watched the sensor display. The massive object drifted closer. 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 The Reth Vadel transmitted a signal. Meridian's translators caught fragments of it. Unidentified vessel, entering restricted Concord territory, alter course immediately. The message repeated 3 times. No response came back. The object continued moving. The cruiser fired a warning beacon. Still nothing. Then the distance between them dropped below 500 kilometers. Sa leaned forward. Now they'll fire. The cruiser's weapons systems powered up. Energy signatures flared along its hull. But before the weapons could discharge, something moved. From the surface of the massive object, several of the long drifting filaments suddenly extended outward. Not fast. Not violently. Almost gently. They reached the Concord cruiser like long fingers. And wrapped around it. The room went completely silent. On the screen, the Reth Vadel was now tangled in those thin, drifting tendrils. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the cruiser's signal vanished. No explosion. No weapons fire. No debris. Just silence. A moment later the cruiser began to change. Pieces of its hull separated slowly. Panels drifted away. The ship's engines detached from the main structure. Entire sections of the vessel came apart with surgical precision. Like a machine being carefully dismantled. Not destroyed. Disassembled. Sa whispered. It's studying it. The massive object absorbed each piece of the cruiser into its shifting surface. Metal. Engines. Weapon systems. Even the internal framework of the ship. All of it vanished into the creature's body. The process took 42 minutes. When it finished, nothing remained of the Reth Vadel. The Concord fleet still did not fire. Yara felt the cold anger inside her chest turn into something sharper. A realization. They've seen this before, she said quietly. Sa looked at her. What? The Concord. She pointed at the tactical display. They aren't surprised. He followed her gaze. The patrol ships were still holding position, watching from a safe distance. None of them had attempted to intervene. None of them had moved to assist the cruiser. None of them had fired a single weapon. They're letting it happen, Sa said slowly. Yes. Yara's voice was calm. Too calm. They knew this thing was coming. The massive object drifted away from the empty space where the cruiser had been. For several hours it moved slowly among the Concord patrol ships, examining them, observing them, but it did not dismantle another vessel, almost as if it had already learned what it needed. Then the object stopped. It rotated slowly in space, and turned toward the inner solar system, toward the bright blue planet orbiting the distant sun. Sa looked at the navigation display. Its projected trajectory appeared as a thin red line across the map. The line ended at the orbit of the moon. The Concord fleet slowly adjusted position. Not to intercept. To maintain distance. To stay safely behind it. Sa's voice was barely audible. They're not defending us. No, Yara said. Her eyes stayed on the red line moving across the display. They're using us. The room was silent. No one disagreed. The Concord had opened the corridor. They had watched the object cross the blockade. They had allowed it to dismantle one of their own ships without retaliation. And now they were letting it move deeper into the solar system. Toward humanity. Toward the weakest civilization in the region. Toward the species that had been told for 62 years it was not ready to join the stars. Yara straightened slowly. "Wake the command staff," she said. Sa looked up. "What are you thinking?" Yara looked out through the viewport again. Far beyond the Concord fleet, the massive shadow drifted silently through space. Approaching. Studying. Learning. "I think," she said quietly, "that the Concord just pointed a monster at our world." Within hours of the object crossing the blockade, the entire solar system knew something was wrong. At first the information spread quietly. Sensor technicians noticed unusual readings. Navigation networks reported an unidentified mass moving through deep space. Observatory stations on the moon began tracking an enormous gravitational disturbance far beyond their usual monitoring zones. Then the images leaked. No one ever discovered who released them. They appeared simultaneously across dozens of civilian networks, grainy long-range scans captured by Concord surveillance arrays before those arrays abruptly stopped transmitting. The media gave the object a name within minutes. The Shadow. Because that was what it looked like. A darkness moving through space that seemed to swallow the stars behind it. The first clear recording played on every screen across Earth within the same hour. Cities stopped. Traffic slowed. People gathered around displays in silence. The image showed the massive structure drifting against a background of distant stars. Its surface shifted slowly, sections opening and closing like living tissue. Long filaments trailed behind it like strands of black hair moving through water. No one had ever seen anything like it. The shadow was not shaped like a ship. It had no symmetry, no engines, no visible weapon systems. And it was enormous. Revised sensor measurements confirmed what Meridian's early readings had suggested. The object measured approximately 300 kilometers across. Large enough to cover entire countries. Large enough to blot out cities if it passed overhead. On Meridian's observation deck, Yara watched the global broadcasts with the same controlled expression she wore during every crisis. But inside, something had hardened. The Concord had known. They had recognized the entity immediately. That was why they had stepped aside. Because they had seen it before. Dr. Sa arrived on the observation deck carrying 3 different data tablets and a look that suggested he hadn't slept at all. "Commander!" Yara turned. "What do we know?" Sa placed the tablets on the console and activated the displays. "More than we did yesterday." The first screen showed a transmission waveform. A deep rhythmic signal pulsing through space. The frequency was extremely low, far below the normal communication bands used by human technology. Sa tapped the display. "This is coming from the shadow. It's transmitting? Constantly." "Language?" Sa shook his head. "Not exactly." The signal pattern was complex, layered oscillations that repeated with subtle variations. Almost like breathing. Or a heartbeat. Sa continued. "I ran the waveform through every translation algorithm we have. There's no structured syntax, no obvious encoding. But the pattern repeats." He tapped another section of the screen. When processed through a resonance filter, a small fragment of the signal stabilizes. The audio playback activated. A low vibration filled the room. A deep, hollow sound that felt less like hearing and more like pressure against the bones of the skull. Then the waveform stabilized into a recognizable shape. One repeating fragment emerged from the noise. Sa slowed the playback. The sound stretched into something almost pronounceable. The room remained silent. Sa lowered the volume. "We don't know if it's a name, a signal marker, or something else entirely." "But it's consistent?" Yara asked. "Yes." He folded his arms. "Every transmission cycle contains the same pattern." Yara looked back at the display. "Then that's what we call it." Sa nodded slowly. "Vyron." The name felt strange in the air. Ancient. Heavy. As if the sound itself carried weight. The next data screen showed a series of reconstructed images taken from Concord long-range arrays. These scans were clearer and far more disturbing. The surface of Vyron was not static. To move, sections rotated slowly around the central mass. Other sections opened and closed like enormous petals. Structures shifted internally, forming new shapes that slowly folded back into the main body. Saw zoomed the image. Those filaments we saw earlier? Yes. They aren't cables or appendages. What are they? Sensors. He enlarged the image further. At the tip of each drifting strand were clusters of small structures, thousands of tiny nodules that pulsed faintly with energy. Each filament contains millions of microscopic receivers. Yara frowned. It's scanning. Constantly. Sa looked up. Everything. The solar system. The Concord ships. Human satellites. Radio transmissions. Thermal signatures. Magnetic fields. All of it. Yara stared at the display. It's learning. Yes. Sa hesitated. And that's not the worst part. He opened the final data screen. This one contained archived files. Encrypted Concord records recovered from intercepted transmissions. Sa exhaled slowly. These came from one of Murin's intelligence contacts. Yara looked up sharply. You're sure they're authentic? Unfortunately, yes. The file titles scrolled across the screen. Incident Report, Orn Encounter. Outer Sector Redirection Event. Existential Entity Classification. Sa opened one of the files. Old sensor images appeared, different star systems, different ships, different locations. But the same massive structure. The same shifting surface. The same drifting filaments. Yara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. This isn't the first time. Sa nodded grimly. No. The report timestamps told the story. The Concord had encountered Vyron before. At least 3 times in the past 2 centuries. Each time the entity had entered Concord territory from deep interstellar space. Each time it had moved slowly through star systems, studying ships and infrastructure the same way it had examined the Reth Vadel. And each time the Concord had done exactly what they had done here. They redirected it by placing something else in its path. A colony. A minor civilization. An isolated research outpost. Something large enough to occupy the entity's attention. Something expendable. Sa's voice was quiet. They don't fight it. Why not? Because they can't. He pointed at the casualty summaries. Entire fleets lost. Weapons that had no measurable effect. Civilizations erased. The Concord had learned the same lesson every time. Fighting Vyron was pointless. But distracting it worked. Eventually the entity always moved on. Toward another region of space. Toward another civilization. Another problem. Another sacrifice. Sa closed the file. We're not the first species they've used as bait. Yara looked back at the tactical map. Vyron's course line was unmistakable. It was moving steadily toward the orbit of the Moon. Toward Earth's major orbital infrastructure. Toward millions of people living in stations and colonies across near-Earth space. She spoke quietly. We're the next one. Sa didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room already understood. For 62 years the Concord had kept humanity locked inside its solar system. They said it was for safety. For stability. For the good of the galaxy. Now the truth was clear. Humanity had never been protected. They had been stored. Kept in reserve. A convenient shield waiting for the moment it would be needed. Outside the viewport, the stars burned quietly across the darkness. And somewhere between them, a 300-kilometer intelligence older than human civilization drifted slowly toward Earth. Studying. Learning. Preparing to understand the next machine it intended to dismantle. Yara straightened. Contact Earth Command, she said. Sa looked up. What do you want to tell them? Yara watched the distant shadow moving through space. Her voice was calm. Tell them the Concord didn't fail to stop it. She paused. They chose not to. The emergency session of the Earth Council began 2 hours after Meridian's report reached the surface. For decades those meetings had followed a familiar pattern. Diplomats argued. Military advisors presented cautious briefings. Concord observers listened politely from the edges of the chamber, occasionally reminding humanity of the limitations placed on their technology and defensive systems. This meeting felt different before anyone spoke a single word. The Concord observers were not present. They had declined the invitation. That alone told Director Hannah Odino everything she needed to know. The council chamber in Geneva filled slowly with representatives from every major government on Earth. Some appeared through holographic projection from their capitals. Others had flown in directly once the global alert was issued. The room buzzed with quiet tension. Everyone had seen the footage. Everyone had heard the name. Vyron. Odino waited until the chamber settled before activating the central display. The image of the massive entity appeared above the council table. For several seconds no one spoke. 300 kilometers of shifting alien structure hung silently in the air. Filaments drifting. Surfaces opening and closing. Like a mechanical organism that had forgotten the difference between machine and life. Admiral Javier Reyes of the Pacific Defense Fleet broke the silence first. That thing destroyed a Concord cruiser. Yes, Odino said. Without firing a weapon. Yes. And the Concord didn't respond. No. Reyes leaned back in his chair. So either they're incompetent. He paused. Or they knew they couldn't stop it. The room remained silent. Odino turned to the next display. Concord intelligence files appeared. Old encounter records. Redacted battle reports. Destroyed fleets. Lost colonies. The pattern was unmistakable. This entity has entered Concord territory at least 3 times before, Odino said. Each time the Concord redirected it toward a smaller civilization. Murmurs spread across the chamber. A representative from the European Alliance spoke sharply. You're saying they sacrificed those systems deliberately? Yes. The word landed heavily in the room. And now they've done the same thing to us, someone whispered. Odino didn't answer. She didn't need to. The data spoke for itself. Vyron's course line moved slowly across the solar system map. The projected path ended at Earth's orbital infrastructure. The moon stations. The shipyards. The communications platforms. Every structure humanity had built in space over 62 years of confinement. Admiral Reyes exhaled slowly. We're the distraction. Another voice joined the discussion. General Amina Rahal of the African Union Defense Command leaned forward. How long until it reaches lunar orbit? The Meridian transmission updated the display. Estimated arrival time, 12 days. 12 days before the entity reached the densest concentration of human space infrastructure. 12 days before it began studying Earth the way it had studied the Concord cruiser. General Rahal shook her head. We don't have anything that can fight that. No, Odino agreed. But that doesn't mean we do nothing. The council room quieted again. For 62 years humanity had been forced into the role of a passive civilization. Technology restrictions. Weapons inspections. FTL research banned entirely. Every attempt to develop advanced defenses had been blocked by Concord oversight. Earth had obeyed. Because the alternative had been war with 23 interstellar civilizations. But that calculation had changed. The Concord had just made it clear that humanity was expendable. That realization spread through the council chamber like cold fire. Odino looked at the representatives one by one. 62 years ago the Concord told us they were protecting the galaxy from our instability. Her voice was calm, measured, controlled. Today we know the truth. She paused. They were protecting themselves. Admiral Reyes nodded slowly. So what happens now? Odino folded her hands. We activate the emergency Terran command. Several council members exchanged surprised glances. That organization had existed for decades. On paper, a theoretical alliance designed to coordinate global defense during a catastrophic extraterrestrial threat. No one had ever expected to actually use it. Until now. General Rahal spoke first. That means unified command authority. Yes. Shared weapons systems. Yes. And full suspension of Concord compliance protocols. Odino met her gaze. Yes. The room went silent again. Breaking Concord restrictions was not a small step. It meant abandoning every agreement humanity had signed over the past 6 decades. It meant building weapons the Concord had forbidden, developing technology the Concord had confiscated, preparing for war against enemies far more advanced than humanity. But the Concord had already chosen humanity's role in the coming disaster. They had made Earth the shield. Now Earth had to decide what kind of shield it would be. Reyes leaned forward. If we activate ETC, every military on the planet answers to one command structure. Yes. Some governments won't like that. Odino allowed herself a faint, humorless smile. They don't have to like it. She gestured toward the image of Vyron floating above the table. They only have to look at that. Silence filled the room again. Then, slowly, the council members began to nod. One by one. Reluctantly at first. Then with growing certainty. For the first time in human history, the nations of Earth faced a threat that did not allow the luxury of disagreement. Admiral Reyes tapped the table. All right. He looked around the chamber. Then we start building. The news reached the public within hours. Governments released partial statements. Military alerts were raised across the globe. Civilian space stations began evacuation procedures. Orbital shipyards accelerated production schedules. Across Earth, millions of people watched the same image of Vyron drifting silently through space. Fear spread quickly. But something else spread with it. Determination. Engineers reopened sealed research archives. Scientists returned to experimental projects that had been abandoned under Concord pressure. Weapons designers pulled forbidden schematics from locked databases. For 62 years humanity had obeyed the rules. Now the rules no longer mattered, because the Concord had already decided humanity was expendable. And if Earth was going to face extinction, it would do so on its own terms. High above the planet, Commander Yar-Oi stood on Meridian's observation deck and watched the distant shadow grow slightly larger against the stars. Behind her the station bustled with new activity. Communications channels flooded with military coordination signals. Civilian traffic moved toward evacuation corridors. The solar system had never been this busy. Yara folded her arms behind her back. Dr. Saw joined her at the viewport. You think we can stop it? He asked quietly. Yara watched the stars for a long moment. Then she answered, I don't know. She turned away from the window. But I know one thing. Saw raised an eyebrow. What's that? Yara's expression hardened. The Concord thinks we're the weakest thing in this system. Her voice was calm. Cold. And they're about to find out how wrong they are. The emergency Terran command activated at 4 o'clock Universal Time. It had existed for 41 years as a theoretical framework buried in international defense treaties, a structure designed for the day humanity might face a threat no single nation could handle alone. Until now, it had never been used. Within 12 hours, the command center beneath the Alps was operational. Military officers from 47 nations filled the underground facility. Generals who had spent decades preparing to fight one another now sat at the same command table, studying the same holographic display of the approaching entity. The room was loud. Arguments erupted constantly. Disagreements over tactics, jurisdiction, and authority nearly turned into physical fights more than once during the first day. But no one walked out, because the image at the center of the room was impossible to ignore. 300 kilometers of alien intelligence drifting steadily toward the inner solar system. Director Hannah Odino stood at the front of the command floor and watched the chaos unfold. She had expected this. Human cooperation had never been neat. But it worked. Eventually. Ladies and gentlemen, she said finally, raising her voice just enough to cut through the noise. The arguments quieted. We have 11 days before Vyron reaches lunar orbit. The holographic map shifted. Projected impact zones appeared across Earth's orbital infrastructure. Moon stations, navigation platforms, shipyards, energy arrays. Everything humanity had built in space over 6 decades. If we do nothing, Odino continued, we lose every off-world facility we possess. After that, the entity will begin studying Earth itself. No one needed clarification about what studying meant. They had all seen the footage of the Concord cruiser being dismantled. Therefore, Odino said calmly, our objective is not survival. She paused. Our objective is to make sure this thing never reaches Earth at all. A general from the North American Defense Directorate leaned forward. With what? Odino turned toward the back of the room. Dr. Sa. Sa stepped forward reluctantly, holding a tablet covered in data. I've been analyzing Vyron's behavior patterns since the first contact, he began. His voice carried across the chamber. This entity isn't behaving like a traditional weapon or invasion force. Then what is it? Someone asked. Sa hesitated. The closest comparison we have is a predator. The room went quiet again. But not a predator driven by hunger, Sa continued. A predator driven by curiosity. He displayed the recordings of the Concord cruiser's destruction. The slow dismantling. The careful extraction of components. It didn't destroy the ship violently, Sa explained. It studied it. He switched to the previous encounter records recovered from Concord archives. This entity appears to move through civilizations the same way a scientist moves through laboratory experiments. Examining, testing, disassembling, learning, then moving on. General Rahal crossed her arms. So how do you stop something like that? Sa exhaled slowly. You confuse it. The generals exchanged skeptical looks. Sa raised a hand. Every record we have suggests Vyron relies on pattern recognition. It studies behavior, learns the rules of a system, then dismantles it piece by piece. He pointed to the combat reports. But there's one pattern in the data. The display changed again. 3 separate incidents appeared on screen. 3 encounters where the entity had paused or changed direction. Each case involved something unusual. Unpredictable signals. Technological anomalies. Inputs that did not match any known behavioral model. Sa tapped the display. When Vyron encounters something it can't easily interpret, it hesitates. A silence followed. Then Admiral Reyes spoke. You're saying it doesn't like confusion? Yes. Reyes leaned back. Good. The Admiral looked around the room. Because if there's one thing humanity is exceptionally good at, he allowed himself a thin smile. It's chaos. Across Earth, the transformation began almost immediately. Factories that had produced civilian electronics for decades switched to manufacturing aerospace components. Automobile plants began assembling armored hull plates. Orbital construction yards started building ships at speeds no Concord inspector had ever approved. For 62 years those shipyards had been limited to small transport vessels and mining platforms. Now those restrictions were ignored. Design files that had been locked away in classified databases resurfaced. Experimental engines. Advanced weapon systems. Defensive technologies that had been banned under Concord oversight. Engineers who had spent their careers designing safe, compliant systems began building machines intended for war. It happened quietly. No global announcement. No dramatic declaration. Just 1,000 small decisions made simultaneously by people who understood that humanity had run out of time to be polite. High above the planet, Meridian became the forward command center for the coming engagement. Commander Yari had not expected the message that arrived 3 days after ETC activation. She read it twice before looking up. Fleet Command Authorization. Promotion Clearance. Strategic Command Authority for the Terran 1st Defense Fleet. Yara blinked once. Then she opened the direct communication channel to Earth Command. Director Odino appeared on the screen almost immediately. You saw the order, Odino said. Yes. You're wondering why we chose you. Yara nodded once. There are officers with more experience. Not with this situation. Odino leaned forward slightly. You were the first person to identify the anomaly. You've studied the blockade for years. You understand both the Concord and the threat better than anyone else in the fleet. Yara absorbed that quietly. How many ships will I have? Odino allowed herself a faint smile. We're building them now. The screen behind her shifted. Blueprints appeared. Angular hull designs. Reinforced armor plating. Heavy weapon arrays. None of them resembled Concord ships. Concord vessels were elegant. Ancient designs refined over centuries. The Terran ships looked different. They were compact, brutal in appearance. Machines designed by a species that had spent 6 decades studying the walls of a cage. How long? Yara asked. Odino's expression hardened. 18 months. Yara stared. Vyron arrives in 11 days. Yes. We can't stop it in 11 days. No. Yara understood. You're planning to slow it down. Odino nodded. Exactly. For 18 months humanity would distract the entity. Feed it decoys. Offer it machines to study. Buy time. Time to build a fleet. Time to build a weapon. Time to turn the weakest civilization in the region into something else entirely. Odino met Yara's eyes. We've been patient for 62 years, Commander. Her voice was quiet. But patience ends today. Outside Meridian's observation window, the stars burned cold and distant. Far beyond them, the massive shadow of Vyron drifted steadily closer. Studying, learning, preparing, and all across Earth, humanity began building the answer. 18 months changed Earth in ways no one would have believed possible a year earlier. From orbit, the planet looked the same. The continents were still where they had always been. Oceans still reflected sunlight across the curve of the world. Cities still glittered at night. But the rhythm of the planet had changed. Earth moved differently now. Every major industrial zone on the planet operated at full capacity. Manufacturing networks that once produced consumer technology now built reactor cores, sensor arrays, and armored hull plating. Entire shipyards expanded outward into orbit, assembling structures so large they could be seen from the surface with the naked eye. No Concord inspectors arrived to stop them. The Concord was watching. But they were not interfering. To them, humanity's frantic activity looked exactly like what they expected. Panic. A young species scrambling to build weapons it didn't understand. That assumption worked in humanity's favor. Because what Earth was building was not panic. It was preparation. Commander, now Fleet Admiral, Dali spent most of those 18 months inside Meridian's command sector. The station had been expanded 3 times since the crisis began. Additional modules were attached to house military planning teams, engineers, and intelligence analysts working around the clock. Yara slept rarely. Most nights she stood in the same observation deck where she had first watched the Concord patrol lines. But the view had changed. The blockade was still there. Concord cruisers still drifted along the outer edge of the solar system like silent wardens. But now, inside that cage, something new moved. Shipyards. Construction platforms. Dozens of skeletal hull frames slowly assembling themselves under the careful guidance of automated drones. Human warships. 17 of them. They were not beautiful. Not like Concord vessels with their sweeping lines and polished alloys refined over centuries. Terran ships looked practical. Angular hulls built around dense reactor cores. Armor plates layered thickly over critical systems. External weapon mounts designed for fast replacement rather than elegance. Every design choice followed the same principle. Survive long enough to win. Yara approved every modification personally. She reviewed weapon tests, flight trials, shield experiments, engine prototypes. Nothing about the fleet was conventional. That was intentional. Concord tactics were based on centuries of experience fighting other advanced civilizations. They expected order, symmetry, predictable formations. Human engineers had studied those doctrines for decades, and they had decided to ignore them completely. Dr. Ilyasa had spent the same 18 months leading a project quietly labeled asymmetry. The name sounded abstract. The concept behind it was not. Sa had built his entire strategy around one fact. Vyron learned by recognizing patterns. It studied technology, cataloged behaviors, mapped predictable responses, then dismantled systems once it understood how they worked. So Sa designed something that did not behave predictably, something that violated the creature's expectations at the most fundamental level. The asymmetry weapon was not a missile, Not a laser. Not a kinetic strike system. It was a signal. A broadcast built directly from Vyron's own internal communication patterns. Ever since the entity had entered the solar system, human sensors had been recording its constant low-frequency transmissions. Those deep rhythmic pulses that echoed through space like a heartbeat. Sa spent months analyzing them, decoding the structure, understanding how the pulses synchronized the different sections of the enormous organism. He eventually discovered that certain parts of the signal functioned like orientation markers. Internal instructions telling Vyron which direction it was facing, where it was moving, what it was approaching. So Sa rewrote those instructions. He reversed specific fragments, bent the timing, inserted contradictions. When the asymmetry signal activated, it would feed Vyron its own language, broken. The equivalent of telling a brain that up was down, forward was backward. Sa had no idea whether the effect would last seconds or minutes. But even seconds might be enough. There was a third part of humanity's preparation that almost no one knew about. A man named Kale Murin had spent 10 years building it. Murin did not wear a uniform. He was not a scientist. Officially, he did not exist. For most of the blockade years, he had operated quietly inside the gray edges of Concord space, building relationships with individuals inside the 23-member species that formed the alliance. The Concord was powerful, but it was not united. Some species had always questioned the morality of the blockade. Others had quietly objected to the Concord's policy of sacrificing smaller civilizations to distract Vyron. Murin found those voices. Carefully, patiently. Over 10 years he built a network of contacts across 4 different Concord species. They were not spies in the traditional sense. They were simply individuals who believed humanity deserved better. When Vyron entered the solar system, Murin activated them. Information began flowing into the emergency Terran command. Concord patrol schedules. Sensor grid weaknesses. Communication protocols. Strategic response times. Details the Concord had never intended humanity to possess. Every piece of data was fed directly into the tactical simulations guiding Yara's fleet. By the time the Terran ships launched, humanity understood the blockade better than the Concord did. During those 18 months, Vyron continued its slow exploration of the solar system. But Earth did not present itself as an immediate target. Instead, humanity fed it carefully chosen distractions. Old satellites, automated research probes, decommissioned stations packed with sensor equipment. Each object was positioned just close enough to attract the entity's attention. Each contained layers of recorded data designed to keep Vyron occupied as long as possible. It worked. The entity dismantled 17 decoy probes and 11 orbital platforms over the course of the year and a half. Each time it paused to study the machines. Each time it absorbed the technology. Each time humanity gained another few weeks. But eventually the decoys ran out. And Vyron began moving toward inhabited stations. The clock was almost finished. On the day the fleet received final launch authorization, Yara stood on the bridge of her flagship. The vessel had been named by the crew. Officially it was TFW-01. But no one used that designation. The crew called it Meridian's Answer. Yara had approved the name herself. Through the forward viewport she could see the rest of the fleet assembling around her. 17 ships. Not large by Concord standards. But each one carried technology humanity had spent 62 years imagining and 18 months perfecting. Behind them, far beyond the inner planets, the Concord blockade ships still watched. They had monitored every stage of construction, every test flight, every launch, and they had done nothing, because they believed humanity was acting out of fear. They believed the fleet was a desperate gamble by a primitive civilization facing extinction. Yara looked at the tactical display. The projected location of Vyron appeared as a slow-moving icon near the outer asteroid belt. Distance from Earth, 200 million kilometers. Still studying. Still learning. Still confident that nothing in this system could challenge it. Yara placed her hands behind her back. Around her, the bridge crew prepared for departure. Navigation systems came online. Weapons arrays powered up. The engines of 17 human warships began to glow. Dr. Saw stepped beside her holding a data tablet. The asymmetry signal is ready. Yara nodded. Good. He hesitated. You know this might not work. Yes. And if it doesn't? Yara looked out at the stars. Then she spoke quietly. Then we improvise. Saw allowed himself a small smile. Of all the strategies humanity possessed, that one might be the most dangerous. The Terran fleet reached the blockade line at 3:12 station time. For 62 years no human military vessel had crossed that boundary. It was not a physical wall. There were no barriers floating in space. But every pilot in the solar system knew exactly where the line was. Concord sensor buoys marked it invisibly across millions of kilometers. Patrol cruisers moved along it like watchful sentries, enforcing the rule humanity had lived under for 2 generations. No human ship passed that line. Until now. Fleet Admiral Yaraoi stood at the center of the bridge aboard Meridian's Answer, watching the navigation display as the fleet approached the perimeter. 17 ships in tight formation. 17 engines burning steadily against the darkness. Ahead of them, the Concord patrol vessels were already reacting. Blue running lights shifted across the tactical screen as the alien cruisers altered course. Not attacking. Not blocking the path. Just observing. Exactly as Murin's intelligence network had predicted. They're signaling, a communications officer said. Yar didn't turn. Display. A transmission appeared on the main screen. The speaker was a Vihari ambassador, tall, gray-skinned, robed in the deep blue garments worn by Concord diplomats. His voice was calm. Always calm. Terran fleet, the translation system said smoothly. You are approaching a restricted perimeter. Concord protocol requires you to halt and return to your designated operating zone. Yara listened without reacting. The ambassador continued. Your recent military activity has been noted. While the Concord understands the distress your species may feel in response to the Vyron entity, unauthorized escalation is not advisable. The message paused. Then came the familiar tone of gentle authority humanity had heard for 62 years. Return to your territory. The Concord will manage the situation. Yara finally spoke. Transmit response. The communications officer nodded. Ready. Yara's voice was steady. Concord Patrol Command. This is Fleet Admiral Yara Oe of the Terran First Warfleet. She allowed a moment of silence. Then she continued. We're leaving. The transmission ended. No further explanation. No argument. Just the truth. Navigation, Yara said. Yes, Admiral. Take us through. The engines of 17 human warships flared brighter, and the fleet crossed the blockade line. For the first time in 62 years, humanity entered open interstellar space. The difference was impossible to measure with instruments. No sensor reading changed. No gravitational field shifted. But everyone on the bridge felt it. The darkness outside the viewport seemed wider. As if the universe itself had suddenly grown larger. Yara allowed herself 3 seconds to experience it. Then she returned to the tactical display. Status of Vyron. Saw checked the sensor feeds. It detected us almost immediately. Reaction? Saw hesitated. None. The massive icon representing the entity had stopped moving. 300 kilometers of alien intelligence now floated silently in the void ahead of them. Its drifting filaments had gone still. The slow rotation of its outer structure had halted. It's watching us, Saw said quietly. Yara nodded. Good. The fleet continued forward. Distance to Vyron, 80,000 kilometers. The entity began moving again. Not toward Earth. Toward the Terran fleet. Phase 1, Yara said. Begin. 17 ships activated their communication arrays simultaneously. But they did not send a message. They sent noise. Across every known frequency band, from deep radio to high-energy transmission beams, the fleet broadcast a chaotic storm of overlapping signals. Languages. Mathematical sequences. Encrypted code fragments. Navigation telemetry. Fragments of music. Fragments of military chatter. Thousands of transmissions layered over one another at maximum output. The effect was immediate. Vyron's filaments twitched. The drifting tendrils began extending outward at irregular angles, searching through the storm of signals. "It's processing everything," Sa said. "That's the point," Yara replied. Vyron learned by analyzing patterns. Humanity had just given it thousands of patterns at once. Conflicting. Contradictory. Impossible to sort quickly. For the first time since entering the solar system, the entity hesitated. 8 minutes later, Vyron began adapting. The filaments shifted. Signal processing nodes activated along its surface. The chaos of transmissions slowly started filtering through its analysis systems. Sa noticed the change immediately. "It's adjusting." "Expected," Yara said. Phase 2. The Terran fleet split instantly into 3 formations. 6 ships accelerated toward Vyron's forward axis. 5 ships swung wide to the left. 6 ships broke to the right. The maneuver was chaotic, irregular. No symmetrical attack formation. No predictable engagement pattern. Concord battle doctrine would have described it as disorganized. That was exactly the idea. Vyron accelerated. The massive structure surged forward with terrifying speed for something its size. One of the drifting filaments snapped outward toward the closest Terran ship. The vessel dodged. Barely. The filament passed through the space where the ship had been seconds earlier, slicing through empty vacuum. "Speed estimates increasing," the navigation officer warned. "Maintain separation," Yara ordered. The fleet scattered further, attacking from constantly shifting angles. Missile salvos launched. Energy bursts flared. But none of the attacks aimed to destroy the entity. Every strike targeted sensors, filaments, peripheral structures, each one forcing Vyron to react in new ways, to process unfamiliar tactics, to revise its understanding of the system it was studying. 3 Terran ships were not fast enough. One vessel from the left wing drifted too close to a cluster of filaments. The tendrils wrapped around the hull before the pilot could escape. The ship vanished into the shifting surface of the entity. 2 more were caught minutes later during a sudden acceleration burst from Vyron. Yara received the casualty reports silently. 3 ships lost. Hundreds of crew members gone. She acknowledged the loss and continued the attack. 90 minutes into the engagement, Sa looked up from his console. "Admiral." "Yes." "The signal structure is stable." Yara nodded once. Phase 3. The asymmetry weapon activated. Meridian's answer transmitted the modified waveform directly into Vyron's core frequency band. The signal carried fragments of the entity's own internal communication system, but twisted, reversed, contradictory. For a moment nothing happened. Then Vyron stopped. Not the cautious stillness it had shown earlier. This was different. The entire structure went motionless. Filaments drifted aimlessly. Rotational segments lost synchronization. Sections of the enormous body accelerated randomly while others slowed to a halt. 300 kilometers of ancient intelligence hung in space. Confused. For 12 seconds, the entity could not understand its own signals. Sa whispered. "It worked." Yara didn't smile. 12 seconds, she said. "Use them." A small Terran vessel named Digger surged forward. Unlike the warships, Digger carried no heavy weapons. It carried something else. Kale Murin stood inside the airlock as the ship closed with the entity's outer surface. His team moved quickly. Magnetic boots touched down against the shifting alien structure. The surface beneath them was alive with movement. But the confusion inside Vyron's systems prevented it from reacting. Murin pulled the small device from his pack. The beacon. A transmitter no larger than a human backpack. He secured it deep inside a natural ridge along the entity's outer shell. The device activated instantly, broadcasting silently, tracking the entity wherever it went. 4 years of power inside a cell no larger than a fist. "Beacon active," Murin said. "Return to ship." The team leapt back toward Digger. The moment the airlock sealed, Vyron woke up. The entity's filaments retracted sharply. Its rotation stabilized. The confusion ended. But something had changed. Instead of attacking, Vyron began moving away. Slowly at first, then faster. 300 kilometers of alien intelligence turned its massive body toward open space. Away from the Terran fleet. Away from Earth. Sa stared at the sensor display. It's retreating. Yara watched the distant shadow grow smaller against the stars. For the first time in recorded history, Vyron had been forced to withdraw. Behind the Terran fleet, the Concord observer ships had been watching the entire battle. They had not interfered. Not once. Now their formation shifted. The cruisers began moving cautiously toward the Terran fleet, approaching the way one approaches something unfamiliar. Something that had just proven itself far more dangerous than expected. Yara opened the fleet-wide channel. Her voice carried across every surviving Terran ship. Well done. There was silence for a moment. Then the bridge crew resumed their work. Because the battle was over. But the consequences were only beginning. For several minutes after Vyron began its retreat, no one on the bridge of Meridian's answer spoke. 300 kilometers of alien intelligence slowly shrank against the distant stars as it moved deeper into open space. The beacon Murin's team had planted was already transmitting. Every few seconds a quiet signal confirmed the tracker was still attached, still following the entity wherever it went. Dr. Sa stared at the display in disbelief. It's really leaving. Yara didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the shrinking shape of the creature that had terrified the Concord for centuries. Finally she spoke. Not leaving. Sa looked up. Then what? Repositioning. Vyron was still moving away. But it wasn't fleeing. Its speed remained steady. Controlled. As if it had simply decided that the solar system was no longer worth studying. Sa exhaled slowly. That's still a victory. Yara nodded. Yes. But the bridge crew did not celebrate. 3 Terran ships had not returned from the battle. Their signals had vanished during the engagement. Those losses hung silently in the room like ghosts. Yara turned toward the tactical display. Damage reports. Officers began speaking again. Hull breaches. Shield overloads. Destroyed sensor arrays. But the fleet was still operational. 14 ships remained combat-capable. That alone was something the Concord had never managed against Vyron. Sa suddenly looked toward the communications panel. Admiral? The officer monitoring the signal traffic raised a hand. We're receiving transmissions. From Vyron? Sa asked. No. The officer zoomed the display. 23 separate signals appeared simultaneously. Each one carrying a different Concord encryption signature. Sa blinked. All of them? The officer nodded. Yes. Every major Concord fleet command in the region was attempting to contact the Terran fleet. Yara allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. They want to talk. Sa crossed his arms. I wonder why. Yara didn't answer. Because the answer was obvious. For 62 years the Concord had believed humanity was a primitive species that needed supervision. Tonight that same species had accomplished something the Concord had failed to do for centuries. They had forced Vyron to retreat. The galaxy's model of humanity had just shattered. The Concord fleet approached slowly. Their ships remained at a cautious distance as they closed the gap with the Terran formation. It was the same careful behavior one might use around a dangerous animal whose limits were still unknown. On Meridian's answer, the main viewport filled with the sleek shapes of Concord cruisers. Elegant vessels forged from technologies thousands of years older than anything humanity possessed. For decades those ships had symbolized power, authority, superiority. Tonight they looked different. They looked uncertain. Sa leaned closer to the window. They're studying us. Yes, Yara said. They're recalculating. Another transmission alert chimed. The communications officer looked at Yara. Admiral? She nodded. Put it on. The screen shifted. A familiar Vahari figure appeared. Not the ambassador who had delivered the original blockade message decades earlier. This one was older. His robes were darker. His posture carried the quiet authority of someone used to speaking for entire civilizations. Fleet Admiral Yara Oe, the translator announced. The Vihari inclined his head slightly. I am Counselor Vethkon, diplomatic representative of the Concord High Council. His voice was calm, controlled, but something beneath the surface had changed. There was no longer any hint of the gentle condescension humanity had heard for 62 years. We have been observing the engagement between your fleet and the Vyron entity. Yara said nothing. We wish to commend the effectiveness of your response, Vethkon continued. That was unexpected. Sa couldn't help smiling slightly. Yara remained expressionless. The Vihari paused. For many centuries the Concord has treated encounters with Vyron as containment scenarios. Redirecting it, Yara said quietly. The Vihari's eyes flickered. Yes. By sacrificing smaller civilizations. A silence stretched across the transmission. Finally Vethkon replied. The survival of the greater galactic community has required difficult decisions. Yara did not argue. She didn't need to. The battlefield behind her spoke loudly enough. 3 Terran ships had been destroyed. But the entity had still retreated. Something no Concord fleet had ever achieved. The Vihari continued. The Concord Council would like to request a formal diplomatic summit with the Terran leadership. Sa raised an eyebrow. That was fast. Yara ignored the comment. What would the summit discuss? Vethkon hesitated slightly. The future relationship between humanity and the Concord. Sa quietly muttered, now they want a relationship. Yara kept her eyes on the screen. Location? Neutral Ground 7. Yara knew the name. An abandoned Concord station between 2 unclaimed star systems. The kind of place used for negotiations when neither side trusted the other's territory. When? She asked. As soon as possible. Yara nodded once. Earth will send representatives. The Vihari inclined his head again. We look forward to the discussion. The transmission ended. Sa leaned back against the console. Well, that was quick. Yara folded her hands behind her back. They didn't have a choice. The Concord had built their understanding of the galaxy over thousands of years. They believed power came from age, from technological refinement, from long-established patterns of control. Humanity had just introduced something new into that equation. Improvisation. Unpredictability. A species willing to rewrite the rules of the game when the old ones stopped working. Sa looked out at the distant Concord ships surrounding the Terran fleet. You think they're scared? Yara watched the cruisers drifting quietly through space. Yes. Of us? No. She looked back at the fading shadow of Vyron far beyond the stars. They're scared of what we might become. Behind the Terran fleet, Earth hung quietly in the darkness. For 62 years it had been a world trapped beneath someone else's authority. Now the first cracks in that authority were beginning to show. And the galaxy was about to learn something the Concord had forgotten. Human patience had limits. Neutral Ground 7 floated alone in the darkness between 2 distant star systems. The station had once been a Concord diplomatic hub centuries earlier, before newer facilities replaced it. Now it drifted in quiet orbit around nothing in particular, an aging structure of gray alloy corridors and dim lighting systems that hummed softly in the silence of space. It was the kind of place chosen for meetings where neither side trusted the other enough to step onto their territory. 23 Concord delegations arrived first. Their ships filled the outer docking ring. Sleek cruisers bearing the insignias of civilizations that had traveled the stars for thousands of years. The Concord High Council had gathered in full. That almost never happened. Inside the station's main chamber, representatives of 23 species waited around a circular table designed to accommodate bodies of wildly different shapes and sizes. Some stood tall and thin like the Vihari. Others were low, broad-bodied beings supported by multiple limbs. One delegation consisted of floating organisms contained inside a transparent atmospheric field. Together they formed the most powerful political alliance in the known galaxy. For centuries the Concord had decided the fate of entire civilizations. Today they were waiting for a single species. Humanity. The Terran delegation arrived in a single ship. No escort fleet. No military display. Just one vessel docking quietly with the station. 5 humans entered the chamber. Director Hannah Odino walked in front. She wore the same dark suit she had worn during the emergency council session on Earth. Simple. Unadorned. Behind her came Fleet Admiral Yar-E, still wearing the uniform of the Terran First War Fleet. Then Dr. Sa. Kale Murin. And finally a small woman carrying a thin datapad. Her name was Deo Obi. She was the legal architect behind Earth's diplomatic strategy. No one in the Concord chamber recognized her name, but many of them would remember it later. The humans crossed the room without hesitation and took their seats. No one bowed. No one asked permission. No one appeared impressed. They sat the way people sit when they believe they belong at the table. Counselor Vethkon rose slowly from the Concord side. The ancient Vihari diplomat studied the 5 humans carefully before speaking. The Concord High Council acknowledges humanity's recent engagement with the Vyron entity. The translator carried his voice clearly across the chamber. Your response has demonstrated capabilities that were not previously known to us. He paused. For that, the Concord expresses its appreciation. The statement was polite, measured, carefully worded. It avoided any admission of error. Director Odino listened without reacting. Vethkon continued. The Concord recognizes that recent events have placed humanity in a difficult position. We regret that your civilization was exposed to the Vyron entity without sufficient warning. A faint ripple of sound passed through the Concord delegates, something between discomfort and annoyance. But no one interrupted him. We therefore propose a renewed partnership between humanity and the Concord, Vethkon said. The words hung in the air. Partnership. For 62 years humanity had been told it was not ready for the galaxy. Now suddenly the Concord wanted cooperation. Odino waited until Vethkon finished speaking. Then she reached into her jacket and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. The page contained only a few lines of text, large enough for every species in the chamber to read from their seats. These are Earth's terms, she said calmly. The room shifted. Several delegates leaned forward. Others whispered quietly to one another. Vethkon remained still. Director Odino spoke again. They are not proposals. She tapped the document. They are conditions. Dr. Sa watched the Concord representatives read the text. He almost felt sorry for them. Almost. The terms were simple. The Concord blockade of the solar system ends immediately. All Concord installations within Terran space will be dismantled under human supervision. All confiscated Terran research and technologies will be returned or shared in full specification. Humanity will receive a permanent seat on the Concord High Council with full voting authority. All future encounters with the Vyron entity will be addressed through a joint Terran-led containment initiative. The chamber remained silent for several seconds. Then a delegate from the Ralith species stood abruptly. The Ralith were among the oldest Concord members. Their civilization had traveled the stars for over 10,000 years. You presume much, the Ralith representative said sharply. You are a single young species that has fought one battle. And yet you arrive here dictating terms to 23 civilizations. Director Odino did not respond. Instead she looked at Yara. The Admiral leaned forward slightly. Her voice was quiet. You're right. The Ralith delegate frowned. What? Yara met his gaze. For 62 years the Concord told us exactly what we were. Her voice remained calm. You studied us. You judged us. You built a cage around our world. The chamber grew very still. And when something appeared that frightened you, Yara continued, you pointed it at us. She gestured toward the stars outside the station. You expected us to break. To panic. To disappear. The Ralith delegate said nothing. Yara leaned back in her chair. Instead we solved the problem you were too afraid to face. The silence in the room felt heavier now. We are not asking the Concord to treat humanity as equals, Yara said. Her voice remained steady. We're informing you that we already are. The debate that followed lasted 4 hours. Some Concord species resisted the terms immediately. Others supported them quietly. A few delegates admitted, carefully, that the Concord's long-standing policy toward Earth had been misguided. Throughout the discussion, Deo Obi spoke rarely. But when she did, the effect was devastating. Every attempt by the Concord lawyers to soften the language of the agreement met a calm response. Every suggestion of delay met a legal counterargument. Every attempt to preserve fragments of the blockade collapsed under her analysis of Concord statutes. She dismantled the legal framework of the blockade the same way Vyron had dismantled the cruiser, piece by piece, until nothing remained. Finally, Counselor Vethkon raised a hand. The chamber quieted. The Concord High Council accepts the Terran terms. The words echoed softly through the station. And just like that, the blockade ended. 1 year later, the first joint expedition fleet gathered at the edge of the solar system. 12 Concord ships, 7 different species. And at the center of the formation, the Terran flagship Meridian's answer. The mission was simple. Track Vyron, study it, and eventually end the threat permanently. Not by redirecting it, not by sacrificing another civilization, but by solving the problem together. Dr. Saw stood on the observation deck watching the stars. A young crew member joined him quietly. She couldn't have been older than 20. She had been born during the blockade. This was her first time seeing open space without Concord restrictions. She stared out the viewport with wide eyes. "What does it feel like?" she asked. Saw thought about the question. He thought about the 18 months of desperate preparation, the battle, the 3 ships that had not returned, the decades of confinement before that. Then he looked back at the stars. "They used to say the universe was closed to us," he said. The fleet's engines ignited. The ships accelerated into deep space. Saw allowed himself a small smile. "Turns out," he said, "it was just a door." The stars stretched ahead of them. And humanity had finally stepped through.